A wounded mountain man stumbled into her isolated cabin, seeking refuge from a blizzard. But when the pregnant Apache woman raised her axe in defense, he whispered a name that shattered everything she thought she knew about the night her husband died. Colorado Territory, February 1881. The wind screamed down from the Continental Divide like the voices of 1,000 angry spirits, driving snow so thick it turned the world into a white void where up and down lost all meaning. In the heart of this wilderness, where no map dared mark human habitation, stood a cabin built from lodgepole pine and sheer determination. Smoke rose from its chimney in defiant ribbons, the only sign of life for 50 miles in any direction. Mira Shadow Deer pressed her back against the cabin door she had just barred shut, her breath coming in visible puffs in the frigid air. At 7 months pregnant, her belly strained against the elk hide dress she had sewn herself, and every movement required careful calculation. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing the storm's violence through her skin. She placed both hands on her swollen middle, whispering Apache words of comfort her grandmother had taught her. Promises that they would survive this night, as they had survived every other trial the mountains had thrown at them. The cabin represented 3 years of backbreaking labor, built log by log after she and her husband Thomas had fled the reservation. They had chosen this remote valley precisely because no white man would think to look for Apache here, where winter could kill the unprepared in a matter of hours. Thomas had been half Apache himself, the son of a cavalry scout and a Karikawa woman, accepted by neither world but determined to create his own. He had taught Mira to trap, to hunt, to read weather signs and animal tracks. Most importantly, he had taught her that survival meant trusting no one except family. But Thomas was 6 months in the ground now, killed by what the territorial authorities had called a hunting accident. A single rifle shot to the back of the head while he tracked elk in the high meadows. They claimed he must have been mistaken for game by another hunter, but Mira knew better. Apache men did not hunt carelessly, and Thomas had been the most careful tracker she had ever known. Someone had murdered her husband, and that someone was still out there in the world, free and unpunished while she struggled to survive alone with a child coming. The storm had been building for 2 days, and Mira had spent those days preparing as Thomas had taught her. She had chopped enough firewood to last a week, filled every container with snow to melt for water, and moved all her preserved meat and winter supplies within easy reach of the hearth. The cabin was small but well built, with thick walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace that drew properly, and oiled hides stretched over the windows to keep out the worst of the wind. It was not luxurious, but it was warm and dry and defendable. She moved carefully to the window, pulling aside the edge of the hide to peer into the swirling white chaos outside. The snow fell so heavily she could barely see the woodpile 10 feet from the door, and the wind howled with such fury that it seemed to shake the very mountains themselves. This was the kind of storm that killed travelers, that buried entire camps under drifts 20 feet deep, that turned the high country into a frozen wasteland where even the wolves stayed hidden in their dens. Nothing human should be moving in weather like this. That was when she heard it. A sound that cut through the wind's roar like a knife through leather. Footsteps, slow, labored, but definitely human, stumbling through the deep snow toward her cabin. Mira's hand moved instinctively to the handle of the double-bladed axe hanging by the door, its weight familiar and comforting in her palm. Thomas had taught her to use it for more than splitting wood. In the hands of someone who knew how to swing it, an axe could take a man's head clean off his shoulders. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. For a long moment, there was only the wind and the hammering of her own heart. Then came a sound that made her blood run cold. A low, pained groan, followed by the wet thud of something heavy hitting the ground. Someone had collapsed on her doorstep, and from the sound of it, they were hurt badly. Mira gripped the axe tighter, her mind racing through possibilities. It could be a trap, Outlaws sometimes used wounded men as bait to lure good-hearted folks into opening their doors. But what kind of outlaw would be out in weather like this? Another groan, weaker this time, barely audible over the storm. Whoever was out there was dying, and dying fast. Mira pressed her ear to the door, listening intently. She heard labored breathing, the kind that came from a man fighting to stay conscious. But no voices, no whispered conversations, no sound of others waiting in the darkness. If this was a trap, it was being executed by a man who was genuinely at death's door. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her distress, and Mira winced at the sudden sharp pain in her ribs. She was 7 months along and showing heavily, her condition impossible to hide. If she opened that door to enemies, she would not be able to fight as she once could, would not be able to run if things went wrong. But if she left an innocent man to die on her doorstep, she would be no better than the animals that roam these mountains. Thomas had always said that survival was important, but survival without honor was just another form of death. She made her decision. Moving as quietly as possible, she lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door and set it aside. The axe felt perfectly balanced in her hands as she raised it high, ready to strike down anyone who meant her harm. With her free hand, she slowly pulled the door open, cold air and snow immediately swirling into the warm cabin. What she saw made her gasp in shock. A man lay crumpled in the snow at her feet, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, dark stains spreading through the white powder around him. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, and hands that looked like they could snap a man's neck without effort. His hair was long and dark, streaked with premature gray, and his face was hidden behind a thick beard matted with ice and blood. He wore the rough clothing of a mountain man, buckskin pants, heavy wool shirt, and a coat made from bear hide that had seen better years. But it was the wounds that caught her attention. 3 distinct cuts across his back, visible through the tears in his coat, deep enough that she could see bone gleaming white in the moonlight. Claw marks. Bear claws from the size and spacing of them. This man had tangled with a grizzly and barely escaped with his life. Blood had frozen in thick rivulets down his back and sides, and his skin had the waxy gray pallor that meant he was deep into shock and hypothermia. Without immediate care, he would be dead within the hour. Mira kept the axe ready as she knelt beside him, using her free hand to check for signs of life. His pulse was weak but steady, his breathing shallow but regular. Up close, she could see that he was younger than his weathered appearance suggested, probably no more than 35, with the kind of deep tan that came from a lifetime spent outdoors. His hands were scarred and calloused from hard work, but his fingernails were clean and trimmed. Not the hands of a man who lived wild and careless. She was about to try to wake him when his eyes suddenly snapped open. They were the color of winter sky, pale blue and sharp as ice, and they fixed on her face with an intensity that made her step back. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then his gaze dropped to the axe in her hands, and his lips curved in what might have been a smile if there had been any warmth in it. "You planning to use that on me, miss?" His voice was rough as sandpaper, barely above a whisper, but there was no fear in it. Just a weary kind of amusement, as if he had looked death in the face so many times that one more threat barely registered. "Because if you are, you might want to hurry it up. This cold's going to finish the job for you soon enough." Mira did not lower the axe. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Her own voice was steady, despite the fear pounding through her veins. She had learned from Thomas that showing weakness to a stranger was the fastest way to end up dead, and pregnancy had not made her any less dangerous. "This is private land, and we don't welcome strangers." The man tried to push himself up on his elbows, but immediately collapsed back into the snow with a grunt of pain. "Name's Garrett Flintridge," he gasped. "I was tracking through the high pass when I ran into some trouble. Bear trouble." Big black sow with cubs, and I was stupid enough to get between her and them. He coughed, and she saw blood on his lips. I've been walking for 2 days trying to find shelter. Your cabin's the first sign of civilization I've seen. You're lying. Myra's grip on the axe tightened. No man walks for 2 days with wounds like that and lives to tell about it. And no bear attack leaves cuts that clean and precise. Those are knife wounds, mister, and fresh ones. Someone carved you up good, and recently. Garrett's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since opening them, he looked genuinely surprised. You know wounds, he said slowly. That's not something most women would spot. He studied her face more carefully, taking in her high cheekbones, the copper tone of her skin, the way she held herself ready for violence. You're Apache. And you're alone up here. That takes either courage or desperation. Both, Mira replied curtly. And I'm asking you one more time, who are you really, and what do you want? The baby kicked again, harder this time, and she fought to keep the pain from showing on her face. The last thing she needed was for this stranger to realize just how vulnerable she really was. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes searching her face as if trying to read her soul. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, more careful. I'm going to reach into my coat pocket now, he said slowly. I'm not going for a weapon. I just want to show you something. Something that might explain why I'm really here. Every instinct screamed at Mira to strike him down before he could move, but something in his tone made her hesitate. She raised the axe higher, ready to bring it down on his skull at the first sign of treachery. Move slow, she warned. And keep your other hand where I can see it. With obvious effort, Garrett worked his right hand into the inside pocket of his coat. His movements were clumsy with cold and blood loss, but deliberate, careful not to make any gesture that could be mistaken for reaching for a weapon. After what felt like an eternity, he pulled out a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. With numb fingers, he began to unwrap it. What he revealed made Mira's world stop spinning. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age but still recognizable. She had not seen it in 6 months, not since the day they had buried Thomas, but she knew every scratch and dent on its surface. It had belonged to Thomas's mother, passed down through 3 generations of Apache women before coming to him. He had worn it always tucked beneath his shirt, close to his heart. Where did you get that? The words came out as barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of all her grief and rage. That belonged to my husband. He was wearing it the day he died. Garrett's eyes never left her face as he spoke the words that would change everything. Thomas Shadow Deer didn't die in a hunting accident, he said quietly. He was murdered. Shot down in cold blood by men who wanted him silenced. And I know who killed him, because I was there when it happened. The axe trembled in Mira's hands as the implications crashed over her like an avalanche. This stranger knew the truth about Thomas's death. He had been there, had witnessed the murder, had somehow come into possession of her husband's most treasured possession. But that raised 1,000 new questions, each one more dangerous than the last. Was he one of the killers come to finish what they had started? Or was he something else entirely? You're lying, she said again, but her voice lacked conviction now. The locket was proof that his story held some truth, even if she could not yet understand what that truth meant. If you were there when he died, why didn't you help him? Why didn't you stop it? Because I was supposed to be dead too, Garrett replied, and now she could hear the pain in his voice, deeper than any physical wound. The same men who killed Thomas left me for dead in a ravine 20 miles from here. They put 2 bullets in my back and threw me over a cliff, but apparently, I'm too stubborn to die easy. I've been hunting them ever since, trying to gather enough evidence to see them hang. Thomas was working with me. He was trying to expose the same men who eventually killed us both. The world seemed to tilt around Mira as she tried to process what he was saying. Thomas had never mentioned working with anyone. had never spoken of any danger beyond the usual risks of frontier life. But then again, Thomas had always been protective of her, especially after they learned about the baby. He might have kept such dangerous knowledge to himself, thinking he was keeping her safe. What men? She demanded. Who would want to kill Thomas? He never hurt anyone, never caused trouble with the authorities. He just wanted to live in peace and raise his family. Garrett struggled again to sit up, and this time he managed to prop himself against the doorframe, though the effort left him gasping and pale. Territorial officials, he said when he could speak again. Men with badges and government authority, running an operation that would make your head spin. They've been stealing Apache land, selling it to railroad companies and mining interests, using their positions to forge documents and eliminate anyone who gets too close to the truth. Thomas found out about it when they tried to buy his cooperation. When he refused to stay quiet, they decided he was too dangerous to live. The pieces began to fall into place in Myra's mind like a puzzle she had not even known she was solving. Thomas's mysterious trips to town in the weeks before his death, his unusual tension and distraction, the way he had suddenly become insistent about teaching her to handle weapons and defend herself. He had known he was in danger, had been trying to prepare her for the worst while keeping her ignorant of the specific threat. Why should I trust you? Myra asked, though she could feel her certainty crumbling. If these men are as dangerous as you say, what's to stop you from being one of them? What's to stop this from being another trap? Garrett reached into his other pocket, moving even more slowly than before, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Because Thomas wrote. You a letter, he said simply. A letter he gave me to deliver if anything happened to him. A letter that explains everything, including why I've spent the last 6 months tracking down the men who killed him instead of delivering it to you right away. Myra's hands shook as she took the paper, immediately recognizing Thomas's careful handwriting on the outside. Her name was written there in the flowing script he had learned from mission school teachers, the letters formed with the same precision he brought to everything else. The paper was worn from handling, creased from being carried for months, but the wax seal that held it closed was still intact. She looked up at Garrett, who was watching her with those unsettling pale eyes, and made a decision that would determine whether she lived or died, whether her child would be born free or orphaned before birth. Slowly, carefully, she lowered the axe. Myra's fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal on Thomas's letter, the cold mountain air making the paper brittle in her hands. Garrett remained slumped against the doorframe, his breathing shallow and labored, but his pale eyes never left her face as she unfolded the document. The familiar sight of her husband's careful handwriting hit her like a physical blow, bringing back memories of love notes hidden in her sewing basket and lists of supplies written in the same precise script. The letter was longer than she had expected, covering both sides of the paper in Thomas's meticulous hand. As she read the first lines, her world began to crumble around her like a house of cards in a windstorm. Thomas had not been the simple mountain man she thought she had married. He had been working as an informant for the federal government, gathering evidence against a conspiracy that reached from the local territorial offices all the way to Washington. My beloved Myra, the letter began. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am no longer able to protect you as I swore to do. I pray that you will forgive me for the deception I have maintained these past months, but I could not risk your safety by involving you in matters that could see us both killed. The man who brings you this letter is Garrett Flintridge, a federal marshal working undercover to expose corruption in the territorial government. You can trust him with your life, as I have trusted him with mine. Myra looked up at Garrett with new eyes, seeing past the mountain man exterior to something harder and more dangerous underneath. A federal marshal. That explained the clean knife wounds, the way he carried himself despite his injuries, the careful way he had approached her cabin. He was not a victim of random violence, but a lawman who had been targeted for elimination. The men we are investigating, the letter continued, have been systematically stealing Apache tribal lands through forged documents and fraudulent treaties. They sell these lands to railroad companies and mining interests for enormous profits, using their government positions to legitimize the theft. When tribal leaders complain or resist, they are eliminated through staged accidents or outright murder. At least 30 Apache men have died in the past 2 years alone, all of them leaders who refused to cooperate with this scheme. The scope of the corruption took Mira's breath away. 30 dead Apache leaders, their deaths disguised as accidents, while white men grew rich from stolen land. She thought of her own people, scattered across reservations and struggling to survive on the barren plots assigned to them, while their ancestral hunting grounds were sold to the highest bidder. The injustice of it made her want to scream, but she forced herself to keep reading. The leader of this conspiracy is a man named Colonel Harrison Blackwood, Territorial Administrator for Indian Affairs. He has convinced his superiors in Washington that aggressive action is necessary to pacify the Apache tribes and open the territory for development. What they do not know is that Blackwood has been pocketing most of the profits from these land sales, while reporting much smaller sums to the federal treasury. He has become wealthy beyond imagination while his victims die in poverty. Mira had heard the name Blackwood before, whispered in Apache camps as a devil who brought nothing but death and misery. Children were warned to hide when his soldiers came through, and tribal elders spoke of him as if he were some evil spirit made flesh. To learn that Thomas had been actively working against such a man filled her with both pride and terror. Garrett and I have been gathering evidence for over a year now, Thomas's letter continued. We have documented dozens of forged documents, recorded testimonies from survivors, and traced the money trail back to Blackwood's personal accounts. We are close to having enough evidence to bring federal charges that will see him and his associates hanged for treason and murder. But Blackwood has become suspicious of our activities. I fear he may move against us before we can complete our investigation. The letter went on to detail specific hiding places where Thomas had concealed copies of evidence, coded messages he had used to communicate with federal agents in Denver, and emergency procedures for contacting help if the worst should happen. It was the methodical planning of a man who knew he was walking into danger, but was determined to see justice done, regardless of the personal cost. If something happens to me, the final paragraph read, Garrett will know what to do with the evidence we have gathered. Trust him completely, my love, for he is the only man I have ever met whose dedication to justice matches his skill with weapons. He will protect you and our child as I would have done. Take the emergency money hidden beneath the loose floorboard by the fireplace and go with him to Denver. Do not attempt to remain in the cabin alone. Blackwood's men will come for you eventually, if only to ensure your silence. I love you more than words can express, and I pray that someday you will understand why I kept these secrets from you. Your devoted husband, Thomas. Mira's hands shook so violently that she nearly dropped the letter. Everything she thought she knew about her life had been a lie. Her quiet, peaceful existence in the mountains had been built on a foundation of danger and deception. Thomas had not been a simple man seeking solitude, but a federal agent risking his life to expose mass murder. And now that danger had followed him to their doorstep. How long have you known? She asked Garrett, her voice barely above a whisper. How long have you been watching us planning this deception? Garrett shifted uncomfortably against the doorframe, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. I first met Thomas 18 months ago, he said quietly. I was investigating reports of Apache leaders disappearing near the territorial border when I came across evidence of the land fraud. Thomas contacted me through intermediaries, offered to help gather information from inside the Apache communities. He said he had personal reasons for wanting to see Blackwood brought down. What kind of personal reasons? Mira demanded, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. Blackwood's men killed his first wife, Garrett replied, confirming her worst fears. She was full-blooded Chiricahua, a medicine woman who refused to cooperate. With efforts to relocate her people to a reservation, they made her death look like a riding accident, but Thomas knew better. That's when he decided to dedicate his life to bringing them down. Even if it meant working with federal authorities he had no reason to trust. The revelation hit Mira like a physical blow. Thomas had been married before, had lost his first wife to the same men who eventually killed him. He had been driven by grief and vengeance, just as she was now. No wonder he had been so careful to keep her isolated and protected. He had already lost one woman he loved to Blackwood's brutality. Why didn't he tell me? She asked, though she already knew the answer to that question too. Why keep me ignorant when my own people were being murdered? Because he loved you, Garrett said simply. Because he wanted to give you and the baby a chance at a normal life, even if he couldn't have one himself. He planned to finish the investigation and see Blackwood arrested, then disappear with you to somewhere safe where you could raise your child in peace. He never intended for you to become involved in this war, but the war had found her anyway. Mira realized. The moment she married Thomas, she had become a target whether she knew it or not. Blackwood's men would never believe that Thomas had kept her ignorant of his activities. They would assume she knew everything, which made her a threat that needed to be eliminated. The men who attacked you, she said, studying Garrett's wounds more carefully. Were they Blackwood's people? Garrett nodded grimly. 3 of them, led by a man named Captain Miles Vance, Blackwood's personal enforcer, and the one responsible for most of the murders we've been investigating. They caught up with me too. Days ago while I was following their trail through the high country. I managed to kill 2 of them, but Vance got away after carving me up pretty good. And he's still out there, Myra said, the implications sinking in. Still hunting you. Hunting both of us now, Garrett corrected. Vance knows I was working with Thomas, which means he knows about you. He'll be back with reinforcements as soon as this storm clears, probably with orders to make sure there are no witnesses left alive. The baby kicked violently, as if responding to her mother's surge of fear and adrenaline. Mira pressed both hands to her belly, trying to calm the child while her mind raced through their limited options. They were trapped in the mountains by the worst blizzard in years, with a wounded marshal who could barely stand and killers who would come for them the moment travel became possible. We need to get you inside, she said, making a practical decision that pushed aside her emotional turmoil for the moment. You're bleeding to death, and I can't protect myself if you die on my doorstep. Garrett looked surprised by her sudden change in tone, but he nodded gratefully. I was hoping you'd come to that conclusion before I froze solid, he said with a weak attempt at humor. I'm not much used to anyone as an icicle. Getting him inside proved to be a monumental task. Even with Mira's help, Garrett could barely support his own weight, and her pregnant condition made it impossible for her to carry much of his bulk. They managed it by inches, with him leaning heavily on her shoulders while she guided him through the door and toward the fireplace. By the time they reached the rough wooden chair by the hearth, both of them were breathing hard and exhausted in the firelight. Garrett's injuries looked even worse than they had outside. The knife wounds across his back were deep and jagged, clearly intended to cause maximum damage and pain. His shirt was soaked with blood, both fresh and dried, and she could see that he had been bleeding steadily for hours. Without immediate medical attention, he would be dead by morning. I need to see those wounds, Mira said, already moving toward the cabinet where she kept her medical supplies. Thomas had insisted she learn basic field medicine, claiming that a woman living in isolation needed to be able to treat everything from cuts to bullet wounds. At the time, she had thought he was being overly cautious. Now she realized he had been preparing her for exactly this situation. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Garrett protested weakly. I've been told I'm not a pretty sight when I'm bleeding. I've seen worse. Myra replied curtly, though she wasn't sure that was entirely true. And if you want to live long enough to see Blackwood hang, you'll let me help you. Unless you'd prefer to bleed out in my chair and leave me to face his men alone. That argument seemed to convince him. With obvious reluctance, Garrett began, working his way out of his coat and shirt, revealing the full extent of the damage that had been done to him. Myra had to bite back a gasp when she saw his back. 3 parallel cuts ran from his left shoulder blade to his right hip, each one deep enough to expose muscle and sinew.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
It was a miracle he had managed to walk at all, let alone travel for 2 days through mountain wilderness. "Dear God," she whispered, reaching for clean cloth and her bottle of whiskey. "How are you still alive?" "Pure stubbornness," Garrett replied through gritted teeth. "And the knowledge that if I die, you and your baby die with me. That's proven to be pretty good motivation for staying conscious." Cleaning the wounds was a brutal process that left both of them shaking. Garrett endured it with stoic silence, his hands gripping the chair arm so tightly that his knuckles went white, but he never cried out or asked her to stop. Myra worked with the methodical precision Thomas had taught her, cleaning away dirt and dried blood, checking for signs of infection, and applying pressure to slow the bleeding. "These aren't random cuts," she observed as she worked. "Whoever did this knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage without hitting anything immediately fatal. They wanted you to suffer. Vance has a reputation for that kind of thing," Garrett said quietly. "He likes to make his victims suffer before he kills them. Claims it sends a message to anyone else who might think about crossing Blackwood." As Myra began stitching the deepest of the wounds, using the fine silk thread she normally reserved for delicate sewing work, she found herself thinking about the man she was treating. Federal marshal or not, Garrett Flintridge was clearly someone who had seen more than his share of violence. His body bore scars from old fights, and his hands had the calloused, steady grip of someone who had used weapons professionally for years. Yet he had risked his life to bring her Thomas's letter, had spent months gathering evidence to avenge her husband's death. "Why?" she asked suddenly, pausing in her stitching to look at his face. "Why risk everything for people you barely knew? Thomas was just an informant to you. I'm nobody. Why not just take the evidence you have and let the federal authorities handle it from there?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeing something she could not. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "Because I've seen what happens when good people trust the system to protect them," he said slowly. "My sister trusted the system when her husband was murdered by claim jumpers. The local sheriff was in their pocket, the territorial judge was their business partner, and the federal marshal assigned to investigate the case mysteriously disappeared before he could file his report. She died waiting for justice that never came." The personal nature of his motivation explained a great deal about Garrett's dedication to the case. Like Thomas, he was driven by personal loss as much as professional duty. Like her, he had learned that sometimes the only justice available was the kind you carved out for yourself. "How long ago?" she asked, resuming her careful stitching. 5 years, Garrett replied. She left behind 2 young children who are now growing up in an orphanage because their mother's killer was never brought to trial. I became a federal marshal specifically to make sure that kind of corruption couldn't hide behind badges and government authority. The similarity between his story and her own was too obvious to ignore. Both of them had lost family members to men who used official positions to commit murder with impunity. Both of them were now committed to seeing those men brought to justice, regardless of the personal cost. It was a bond forged in shared grief and determination. "Tell me about Vance," Myra said as she moved on to the second wound. "If he's coming back, I need to know what we're facing." Garrett's jaw tightened at the mention of the name. "Captain Miles Vance, formerly of the 7th Cavalry, dishonorably discharged for excessive brutality during the Apache Wars. Blackwood recruited him specifically because of his reputation for violence and his personal hatred of Apache people. He's responsible for at least 20 murders that we can prove, probably twice that many that we can't. What does he look like? Mira asked, though she was beginning to fear she already knew the answer. Tall, thin, with pale hair and a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He wears a cavalry saber even though he's no longer military, and he has a habit of carving his initials into his victims before he kills them. Mira's hands froze in the middle of a stitch. She had seen that scar before, had looked into those cold, pale eyes and felt the chill of pure evil. 6 months ago, a man matching that exact description had come to the cabin, asking about Thomas. He had claimed to be a territorial surveyor conducting a land assessment, but something about him had made her skin crawl. Thomas had been away that day, and she had told the stranger nothing except that her husband was hunting and would not return for several days. He was here, she whispered, the memory flooding back with perfect clarity. 6 months ago, just a few weeks before Thomas was killed. He came to the cabin asking questions. Garrett's entire body went rigid. What kind of questions? About Thomas's activities, where he went when he traveled to town. Whether he had ever mentioned working with federal authorities. I told him nothing, but he already seemed to know more about us than any stranger should have known. That's when they decided Thomas was too dangerous to live, Garrett said grimly. Vance must have been conducting surveillance, gathering information for the kill order. The fact that he came here personally means Blackwood considered your husband a serious threat. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, painting a picture of calculated murder disguised as accident. Thomas's death had not been a crime of opportunity, but the execution of a carefully planned assassination. Vance had probably been watching them for weeks, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They'll come back, Mira said, though it was less a question than a statement of fact. As soon as the storm ends, they'll come back to finish what they started. Yes, Garrett agreed. But this time, we'll be ready for them. The storm raged for 3 more days, giving them time that felt both precious and agonizing. Garrett's wounds began to heal under Myra's careful attention, though he remained weak and moved with obvious pain. During the long hours trapped inside the cabin, she learned more about the man her husband had trusted with their lives, and what she discovered both impressed and terrified her. Garrett Flintridge was not the simple mountain man he appeared to be. Born in Missouri to a family of lawyers and judges, he had received education at West Point before serving as a cavalry officer in the final years of the Apache Wars. His transformation into a federal marshal had come after witnessing corruption so blatant that it shook his faith in military authority. When his sister was murdered and the territorial justice system failed her completely, he had requested assignment to the most dangerous undercover work available. I wanted to hunt monsters, he told her on the second morning as she changed his bandages. Turns out, the real monsters wear badges and hide behind government authority. They're harder to kill than outlaws because they've convinced everyone they're the good guys. Mira found herself studying his face as he spoke, noting the intelligence behind those pale blue eyes and the careful way he chose his words. This was a man accustomed to thinking several moves ahead, to planning for contingencies that might not arise for months or years. It explained how he had survived 18 months of undercover work in territory where Apache informants were routinely murdered. Thomas trusted you completely, she observed, testing the tension in fresh stitches. That wasn't easy to earn. He'd been betrayed by white men before. Trust had to be mutual, Garrett replied. I was asking him to risk his life and yours for evidence that might never see the inside of a courtroom. The least I could do was prove I was willing to die alongside him if things went wrong. As his strength slowly returned, Garrett began teaching Mayra things that Thomas had never thought to show her. how to recognize the sound of approaching horses from miles away, how to distinguish between natural forest sounds and the deliberate noise made by men trying to move quietly, how to prepare defensive positions that would give a single person advantages against multiple attackers. Your husband was a good teacher for wilderness survival, Garrett said as he showed her how to reinforce the cabin's window shutters with wooden bars. But he wasn't thinking like someone who expected military assault. We need to prepare for men who know how to coordinate attacks and use superior numbers effectively. The cabin transformed under his guidance from a simple mountain dwelling into something resembling a small fortress. They moved furniture to create barriers that would force attackers into predictable patterns of movement. They prepared multiple escape routes through windows and even discussed the possibility of using the root cellar as a last refuge if the main cabin became untenable. But it was the weapons preparation that truly opened Myra's eyes to the level of danger they were facing. Garrett carried more than the simple hunting rifle she had initially assumed. Hidden in his pack were 2 Colt revolvers, a military-issue carbine, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. More disturbing was his casual assumption that they would need all of it. "Vance won't come alone," he explained as he cleaned and checked each weapon with professional efficiency. "Blackwood will send at least 6 men, possibly more. They'll surround the cabin and try to force us out into the open where they can use their numbers advantage. Our only hope is to make them pay such a high price for every inch that they decide. We're not worth the casualties." The mathematical nature of his analysis chilled Myra more than the mountain wind. He was calculating their survival in terms of ammunition expenditure and acceptable loss ratios, like a general planning a campaign, rather than a man preparing to defend his life. It drove home the reality that this was not going to be a simple confrontation, but a battle between professional killers. On the 3rd day, as the storm finally began to show signs of breaking, Garrett made a discovery that changed everything. While examining the loose floorboard where Thomas had hidden their emergency money, he found something unexpected wedged deep beneath the cabin's foundation timbers. A small metal strongbox, carefully wrapped in oiled leather and secured with a combination lock. "Thomas never mentioned this," Myra said as Garrett worked to extract the heavy box from its hiding place. "I helped him hide the money, but I never saw him put anything else down there." "Maybe he didn't want you to know about it until it became necessary," Garrett suggested. "The combination lock suggests this contains something more valuable than money." It took him nearly an hour to work through possible combinations, trying birth dates, anniversaries, and numerical codes that might have been significant to Thomas. Finally, in desperation, he tried the date of the massacre at Apache Pass, a battle that had claimed hundreds of Apache lives and marked the beginning of the end for tribal resistance. The lock clicked open. Inside the strongbox were documents that made their previous evidence look insignificant by comparison. Maps showing the locations of mass graves where murdered Apache leaders had been buried. Photographs of forged treaties bearing official government seals. Financial records proving that Blackwood had personally profited from land sales worth over $2 million. And most damaging of all, copies of telegrams between Blackwood and federal officials in Washington, clearly showing that his superiors knew about the murders and had authorized them as necessary for territorial pacification. "This isn't just territorial corruption," Garrett breathed as he examined the telegrams. "This goes all the way to the War Department. Blackwood has been operating with federal approval, carrying out what amounts to government-sanctioned genocide." The scope of the conspiracy left Myra reeling. She had known that her people faced systematic persecution, but she had never imagined that the murder of Apache leaders was official federal policy disguised as law enforcement. The documents in the strongbox proved that what appeared to be isolated incidents of frontier violence were actually coordinated military operations designed to eliminate tribal resistance. "How many people know about this?" she asked, though she was beginning to fear the answer. Based on these telegrams, at least a dozen federal officials, possibly more. Senators, War Department administrators, territorial governors. This isn't the work of a few corrupt local officials. This is a coordinated policy of extermination being carried out by the highest levels of government. The implications were staggering. If federal authorities in Washington were complicit in the murders, then simply presenting evidence to them would accomplish nothing except getting more people killed. Traditional legal channels had been compromised from the beginning, which explained why Blackwood had been able to operate with impunity for so long. What do we do with this? Mira asked, gesturing at the damning documents. If we can't trust federal authorities, who do we turn to? Newspapers, Garrett said immediately. Specifically, Eastern newspapers that aren't dependent on territorial advertising or federal contracts. There are publishers in New York and Boston who would pay handsomely for this kind of story, especially if we can provide photographic proof and survivor testimony. And you think that would be enough to stop them? Public outrage has toppled bigger conspiracies than this one. The American people may tolerate a certain amount of frontier violence, but government-sanctioned genocide is another matter entirely. If we can get this story printed in the major Eastern papers, Congress will be forced to investigate, if only to save their own political careers. It was a plan that offered hope, but Mira could see the enormous risks involved. Getting the documents to Eastern publishers would require traveling through territory controlled by Blackwood's men, carrying evidence that would see them killed instantly if they were caught. And even if they succeeded, there was no guarantee that newspaper stories would be enough to bring down men with such powerful connections. First, we have to survive the next few days, she pointed out. These documents won't help anyone if we're dead. True, Garrett agreed. But they do give us something we didn't have before, leverage. If Vance takes us alive, these documents become our bargaining chip. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound they had been dreading finally reached their ears. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving through the snow at a deliberate pace, making no effort to conceal their approach. Mira felt her baby kick violently as adrenaline flooded her system, and she pressed both hands to her belly in an instinctive protective gesture. Garrett was already moving toward the window, carbine in hand, his previous weakness apparently forgotten in the face of immediate danger. 6 riders, he reported after peering through a gap in the shutters. They're stopping about 200 yards out, probably planning their approach. Can you see Vance? Mira asked, checking the loads in both revolvers with hands that remained remarkably steady despite her racing heart. Not yet, but he's out there. This is exactly the kind of methodical approach he's known for. He'll send men to surround the cabin while he positions himself for the final assault. The waiting was the worst part. Mira found herself listening to every sound, trying to distinguish between wind-blown snow and the careful footsteps of men moving into position around their cabin. The baby seemed to sense her tension, kicking and squirming restlessly as if trying to escape the danger pressing in from all sides. They're taking their time, Garrett observed, his voice carefully neutral. That's actually good news. It means they're being careful, which suggests they respect our ability to fight back. Or it means they want to take us alive, Mira countered. Maybe they need to know what we've learned before they kill us. Either way, we make them work for it, Garrett said grimly. And if things go badly, you promise me you'll use that final bullet on yourself rather than let Vance take you alive. The casual way he suggested suicide as a preferable alternative to capture drove home the true nature of the man they were facing. Mira had heard stories of Vance's cruelty, but she had assumed they were exaggerated frontier legends. Garrett's grim certainty suggested that the reality was actually worse than the stories. A new sound reached them from outside. Voices calling across the snow, too distant to make out words but clearly coordinating movements. The attack was beginning, and there was no longer any doubt about the outcome they were facing. 6 trained killers against a wounded marshal and a pregnant woman. The mathematics of survival were not encouraging when this starts, Garrett said quietly. Stay low and don't expose yourself unnecessarily. They'll try to flush us out with gunfire first, then move in when they think we're pinned down. Our advantage is that they don't know about the strongbox or how much ammunition we have. What about the documents? Mira asked. If they kill US, all of this dies with us. Not necessarily, Garrett replied, pulling out a piece of paper and quickly sketching a rough map. There's a cache 20 miles north of here, marked by 3 lightning-struck pines in a triangle formation. I've hidden copies of other evidence there, along with instructions for contacting newspaper publishers in the East. If we don't survive this, eventually someone will find it. The fact that he had prepared for their deaths with such methodical precision should have been depressing, but instead Mira found it oddly comforting. Whatever happened in the next few hours, their sacrifice would not be meaningless. The truth about Blackwood's conspiracy would eventually see daylight, even if they were not alive to witness his downfall. A sharp crack echoed across the valley, as someone stepped on a fallen branch, the sound carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The attackers were moving closer, probably within 50 yards of the cabin now. Mira checked her weapons one final time and took up position at the window Garrett had assigned to her, trying to ignore the way her swollen belly made it difficult to find a comfortable shooting stance. Remember, Garrett whispered, don't shoot until you're certain of hitting your target. Every bullet has to count. The first shot came without warning, shattering the silence like thunder. A rifle bullet punched through the cabin's wooden wall 6 inches from Myra's head, sending splinters flying across the room. The battle for their lives had begun, and there would be no mercy for the defeated. But as Mira steadied her revolver and prepared to return fire, she felt something unexpected. Not fear, but a cold, burning anger that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep in her bones. These men had murdered her husband, destroyed her peaceful life, and now threatened the life of her unborn child. They might kill her, but she would make them remember the cost of crossing Mira's shadow deer, the war. Cry that erupted from her throat was pure Apache, a sound her grandmother had taught her in childhood and that she had never expected to use. It was the voice of generations of warriors who had fought to defend their people against impossible odds, and it carried across the snowy valley like a promise of vengeance. The final battle was about to begin. The sound of her war cry seemed to startle the attackers, causing a momentary pause in their gunfire that Garrett immediately exploited. His carbine cracked twice in rapid succession, and Mira heard a distant scream of pain followed by angry shouting from the tree line. First blood to the defenders, but she knew it would only make their enemies more cautious and determined. 1 down, 5 to go, Garrett reported grimly, working the lever of his carbine to chamber another round. But that was probably the easiest shot I'll get. They'll be more careful now. The response came in the form of concentrated rifle fire that hammered the cabin from 3 different directions simultaneously. Bullets punched through the wooden walls in a deadly crossfire, forcing both defenders to press themselves flat against the floor as lead flew overhead. The coordinated nature of the attack confirmed Garrett's assessment that they were facing professional killers rather than common outlaws. During a brief lull in the gunfire, Mira heard something that made her blood run cold. A voice calling from outside, cultured and precise despite the circumstances, with the unmistakable tone of military command authority. Captain Miles Vance had arrived to personally oversee their execution. Marshal Flintridge, the voice called across the snow. I know you're in there, and I know you're wounded. Surrender now, and the woman dies quickly. Continue this futile resistance, and I'll make sure she suffers for hours before I grant her the mercy of death. Garrett's face went white with rage at the threat, but he forced himself to remain calm and professional. Vance always was fond of psychological warfare, he told Myra quietly. Don't let him get inside your head. He's trying to make us panic and do something stupid. I've heard stories about what he does to Apache women, Myra replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. I'd rather die fighting than give him the chance to prove those stories true. The next assault came from an unexpected direction. Instead of more rifle fire, the attackers began throwing burning brands onto the cabin's roof, trying to set the structure ablaze and force the defenders into the open. Myra could hear the crackling of flames above their heads and smell the acrid smoke beginning to seep through the ceiling boards. They're trying to burn us out, she observed, stating the obvious but needing to voice the new threat they were facing. How long before the roof catches completely? Maybe 20 minutes if we're lucky, Garrett replied, already moving toward the ladder that led to the small loft space. I need to get up there and knock those brands off before they take hold. That's suicide, Myra protested. The moment you show yourself on that roof, they'll cut you down. Maybe, Garrett acknowledged. But if I don't try, we'll burn to death anyway. Sometimes the only choice is between different ways of dying. Before Myra could argue further, he was climbing toward the loft with his revolver clenched between his teeth and a bucket of water in his free hand. She heard his boots on the vinyl. Roof boards above, followed immediately by a renewed volley of gunfire as the attackers spotted their target. But somehow, impossibly, she also heard the hiss of flames being extinguished as Garrett managed to douse at least some of the burning brands. A grunt of pain from above told her that he had been hit, but his continued movement suggested the wound was not immediately fatal. After what felt like an eternity, he dropped back down through the loft opening. Blood streaming from a bullet grazed across his left shoulder, but grinning with fierce satisfaction. Got most of them, he reported. But they'll try again, and next time they might use more brands than I can handle. We need to change the dynamic of this fight before they overwhelm our defenses. What do you have in mind? Myra asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the look in his eyes. Counterattack, Garrett said simply. They're expecting us to stay pinned down in here while they systematically destroy our position. The last thing they'll expect is for us to come out fighting. The plan he outlined was audacious to the point of madness, but Myra had to admit it had a certain ruthless logic. While the attackers were focused on the cabin's main entrance and windows, she would slip out through the root cellar tunnel that emerged 50 yards away behind a stand of pine trees. From there, she could circle around and attack their flanks while Garrett provided covering fire from the cabin. I'm 7 months pregnant, she reminded him. I can barely walk across a room without getting winded, let alone crawl through a tunnel and fight armed men in the snow. You're also Apache, Garrett countered. Your people have been fighting outnumbered battles for generations. It's in your blood, and right now it might be our only chance of survival. The sound of voices outside suggested that the attackers were preparing for another assault, possibly their final push to overrun the cabin. Whatever they were going to do, they needed to do it quickly before their enemies realized how desperate their situation had become. If I don't make it back, Myra said as she checked her weapons one final time, make sure those documents get to the newspapers. Make sure the world knows what Blackwood and his men have done. You'll make it back, Garrett said with more confidence than she felt. And when this is over, we'll deliver those documents together. Your husband's death will be avenged, and justice will finally be served. The root cellar tunnel was even more cramped and difficult than she had expected, forcing her to crawl on hands and knees through a space barely wide enough for her shoulders. Her swollen belly made every movement awkward and painful, and more. Then once she had to stop and rest as the baby kicked in protest at the uncomfortable position. But Apache endurance and determination drove her forward, inch by agonizing inch. When she finally emerged from the tunnel behind the pine trees, the scene that greeted her was exactly what Garrett had predicted. 5 men positioned in a rough semicircle around the cabin, all of them focused on the building and completely unaware that their prey had escaped the trap. She could see Vance clearly now, a tall figure in a military greatcoat, directing his men's movements with the casual authority of someone accustomed to command. The revolver felt heavy in her hands as she took careful aim at the nearest attacker, a bearded man kneeling behind a fallen log about 30 yards away. At this range, with a steady rest and no wind to deflect the bullet, she could hardly miss. But taking the shot would announce her presence to the other 4 men, turning her from hunter into hunted in the space of a heartbeat. She thought of Thomas, lying dead in the mountains with Vance's bullet in his brain. She thought of the 30 Apache leaders murdered for the crime of defending their people's land. She thought of the child growing in her belly, who deserved to be born into a world where justice was more than just a word.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Then she squeezed the trigger, the revolver bucked in her hands, and the bearded man pitched forward into the snow with a cry of pain and surprise. Before his companions could react, she had shifted her aim to the second target, a younger man, who was just beginning to turn toward the sound of gunfire. Her second shot took him in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him behind his makeshift cover. Now the remaining 3 attackers knew where she was, and their return fire began immediately. Bullets whined through the pine branches above her head as she scrambled for better cover, trying to reach a boulder formation that would provide protection from multiple angles. Behind her, she could hear Garrett's carbine adding its voice to the battle as he took advantage of the confusion to engage targets from the cabin. The firefight that followed was brief, but savage. Mira found herself moving and shooting with an instinctive skill that surprised her, as if her Apache heritage had awakened something primal in response to mortal danger. She used the terrain to her advantage, appearing long enough to take a shot before disappearing behind cover, keeping her enemies guessing about her exact position. One by one, the attackers fell to the coordinated fire from 2 directions. The 3rd man went down when Garrett's bullet found him as he tried to flank Myra's position. The 4th died when she caught him reloading in the open, putting a bullet through his heart before he could chamber another round. That left only Captain Miles Vance, and he was no ordinary opponent. "Impressive shooting for a pregnant squaw," Vance called out, his voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered battlefield. "Thomas always said you were dangerous, but I didn't believe him until now. He would be proud of how well you've learned to kill." The casual mention of her husband's name filled Mira with cold rage, but she forced herself to remain hidden and patient. Vance was trying to goad her into revealing her position, probably hoping she would make the same kind of emotional mistake that had gotten other opponents killed. She would not give him that satisfaction. Of course, Thomas won't. "Be around to see how this ends," Vance continued, moving carefully through the trees as he tried to locate her hiding place. "Did Flintridge tell you how your husband died? How he begged for his life at the end, promising to forget everything he had learned if I would just let him live to see his child born?" The words hit Mira like physical blows, but she recognized them as psychological warfare designed to break her concentration. Thomas would never have begged for anything, and certainly not from the man who had murdered his first wife. Vance was lying, trying to undermine her resolve with false claims about her husband's final moments. "He died like a warrior," she called back, shifting position as she spoke to avoid giving away her location. "And you're going to join him very soon." Vance's laughter was cold as winter wind. "We'll see about that, little Apache. I've killed more of your people than you can count, and I'm not about to let a pregnant woman be the one who finally brings me down." The final confrontation came suddenly and without warning. Vance appeared around a massive pine tree not 10 feet from where Myra was hidden, his cavalry saber gleaming in his hand and a revolver pointed directly at her chest. For a frozen moment, they stared at each other across the snow, predator and prey locked in a deadly tableau. Then Garrett's voice cut through the tension like a knife blade. "Vance!" The captain spun toward the sound, and in that instant of distraction, Mira fired her last bullet. The shot took Vance in the side, spinning him around but not dropping him immediately. He tried to bring his own weapon to bear, but Garrett's carbine spoke first, the heavy bullet catching the captain's center mass and driving him backwards into the snow. For a long moment, the valley was silent except for the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant crackling of dying flames on the cabin roof. Then Garrett appeared through the trees, moving carefully with his carbine ready, approaching the fallen captain like a hunter approaching wounded game. "Is he dead?" Mira asked, struggling to her feet with one hand pressed protectively over her belly. The baby was kicking frantically, responding to her elevated heart rate and the adrenaline still flooding her system. Garrett knelt beside Vance's still form, checking for signs of life with professional thoroughness. "He's finished," he confirmed. The Apache wars are finally over for Captain Miles Vance, but even as relief flooded through her, Mira knew that their victory was incomplete. Vance was dead, but Colonel Blackwood was still alive and free, still directing his campaign of murder and theft from his territorial office. The battle was won, but the war for justice was far from over. The morning after the battle dawned clear and bitter cold, the kind of mountain weather that turned exhaled breath into ice crystals and made exposed skin burn with painful intensity. Mira stood in the doorway of her cabin, surveying the scene of carnage scattered across the snow-covered clearing. 5 bodies lay where they had fallen, already beginning to freeze solid in the sub-zero temperatures. By spring, when the snow melted, there would be nothing left but bones and scraps of clothing to mark where Captain Vance and his men had met their end. Garrett moved among the corpses with methodical efficiency, searching through their belongings for anything that might prove useful in their ongoing war against Colonel Blackwood. The dead men's weapons and ammunition would certainly be valuable, but he was looking for something more important. Evidence that would reveal the scope of Blackwood's network and perhaps provide clues about where to strike next. "Find anything interesting?" Mira asked, wrapping Thomas's heavy coat more tightly around her shoulders. The baby had been unusually quiet since the battle ended, as if sensing that the immediate danger had passed but greater challenges lay ahead. "More than I expected," Garrett replied, holding up a leather portfolio he had taken from Vance's body. Orders, maps, lists of names and locations. Vance was carrying enough information to hang half the territorial government for treason and murder. The portfolio contained documents that painted a picture of corruption far more extensive than even their previous evidence had suggested. Blackwood's conspiracy included not only territorial officials, but also railroad executives, mining company owners, and federal bureaucrats whose names appeared on letterheads from Washington. The systematic theft of Apache lands was just one part of a larger scheme to exploit every natural resource in the territory while eliminating anyone who might interfere. "Look at this," Garrett said, pointing to a detailed map marked with red X's scattered across hundreds of square miles. Every mark represents either a completed murder or a planned assassination. There are over 60 locations marked, which means we've only seen the beginning of what Blackwood has planned. Mira studied the map with growing horror, recognizing many of the marked locations as Apache settlements, trading posts, and isolated homesteads where mixed families like hers had tried to build peaceful lives away from reservation restrictions. Blackwood wasn't just stealing land. He was conducting a campaign of systematic extermination designed to empty the entire territory of anyone who might oppose his ambitions. "We have to warn them," she said immediately. "All these people who don't even know their targets. We can't just let them be murdered while we run off to safety." "Warning them won't be enough," Garrett replied grimly. "Blackwood has the resources to hunt down anyone who tries to organize resistance. These people need more than warnings. They need to disappear completely or find some way to fight back effectively." As they studied the captured documents, a new plan began to take shape in Myra's mind. Instead of simply fleeing to Denver with their evidence, they could use Blackwood's own strategy against him. The colonel had built his power through systematic elimination of threats, but that same approach could be turned around and used to dismantle his organization from within. "What if we don't run?" she suggested. "What if we stay and fight, but do it smart? Use these documents to identify his key people and eliminate them before they can carry out more murders." Garrett looked up from the papers with surprise and something that might have been admiration. "You're talking about becoming assassins? Ourselves? Hunting down government officials and killing them in cold blood?" "I'm talking about war," Mira corrected. "Blackwood declared war on my people years ago. The only difference is that now we know who the real enemy is and how to fight back effectively." The moral implications of what she was suggesting were enormous, but Mira found that she felt no hesitation or doubt about the path she was choosing. These men had murdered her husband, threatened her unborn child, and planned the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. Traditional law had failed to stop them, which meant that frontier justice was the only option remaining. Over the next several hours, they developed a plan that was both ambitious and dangerous, beyond any reasonable measure. Using the information in Vance's documents, they would identify the most important members of Blackwood's conspiracy and systematically eliminate them, starting with the men responsible for carrying out murders and working their way up the chain of command toward the colonel himself. "The first target should be Judge Hamilton Marsh," Garrett said, pointing to a name that appeared repeatedly in the captured correspondence. "He's the one who legitimizes the forged land transfers and issues death warrants disguised as arrest orders. Without him, Blackwood loses his legal cover for the murders." Judge Marsh lived in the territorial capital, protected by a mansion full of hired guards and the assumption that his official position made him untouchable. Getting close enough to kill him would require careful planning and probably a willingness to sacrifice their own lives in the attempt. But Mira was past caring about personal safety. She was thinking like a warrior now, focused only on achieving victory regardless of cost. "How do we get to him?" she asked. "A pregnant Apache woman and a wounded federal marshal aren't exactly inconspicuous. The moment we show ourselves in the capital, every law enforcement officer in the territory will be hunting us." "Not if we don't look like ourselves," Garrett replied thoughtfully. "I still have contacts in Denver, people who can provide false papers and disguises. If we can make it that far without being recognized, we might be able to create new identities that will let us move freely." The journey to Denver would be treacherous under the best of circumstances, requiring them to travel over 300 miles through mountain wilderness in the depths of winter. With Myra's pregnancy and Garrett's injuries, the physical challenges alone might prove insurmountable. Add the fact that Blackwood's men would be searching for them along every possible route, and their chances of survival seemed impossibly slim. But as they prepared to abandon the cabin that had been her home for 3 years, Mira felt something unexpected, a sense of purpose that was stronger than fear or doubt. For the first time since Thomas's death, she knew exactly what she needed to do and why she needed to do it. The grief and rage that had consumed her for months were transforming into something more useful. Cold, focused determination to see justice done. They left the cabin just after sunset, traveling light and moving carefully through terrain that Mira knew better than any white man alive. The bodies of their enemies lay where they had fallen, already attracting the attention of wolves and ravens that would dispose of the evidence more effectively than any burial. By spring, nothing would remain to mark the site of the battle except perhaps a few scattered bones. The first night of their journey was the hardest. Mira's pregnancy made it difficult for her to maintain the rapid pace that mountain travel required, and Garrett's wounds reopened from the strain of carrying their supplies through deep snow. They were forced to take shelter in a cave barely large enough for 2 people, huddled together for warmth while wind howled through the mountain passes above them. "Are you having second thoughts?" Garrett asked as they shared a meager meal of dried meat and melted snow. Once we start down this path, there won't be any way to turn back. We'll be outlaws ourselves, hunted by every lawman in the territory. Good. Mira replied without hesitation. Let them hunt us. We'll give them something to remember when they catch up. The second day brought new challenges in the form of a blizzard that reduced visibility to mere yards and turned the simplest movement into a life-threatening struggle. They were forced to rope themselves together to avoid becoming separated in the whiteout conditions. With Mira leading the way through terrain she could navigate by feel and instinct even when she couldn't see her own feet. During the worst of the storm, they encountered other travelers, a family of homesteaders fleeing east with everything they owned loaded onto a single wagon. The man was half frozen and barely conscious, while his wife tried to keep their 3 young children warm under inadequate blankets. They were clearly city people who had no business attempting mountain travel in winter weather. Please. The woman begged when she saw Mira and Garrett emerging from the storm. My husband is dying, and we're lost. We don't know which way to go. Garrett started to shake his head, clearly reluctant to take on additional responsibilities when their own survival was far from certain. But Mira was already moving toward the wagon, her maternal instincts overriding practical considerations. These people would die within hours without help, and she couldn't stand by and watch children freeze to death. There's a mining camp about 5 miles north of here, she told the woman. Follow that ridgeline until you see smoke, then head straight toward it. Tell them Apache Mary sent you, and they'll give you shelter until the storm passes. Apache Mary? Garrett asked quietly as they watched the wagon disappear into the swirling snow. I thought you were trying to avoid drawing attention to yourself. Those people were dying, Mira replied simply. And the miners up there know me from when Thomas used to trade with them. They'll help anyone I send them, no questions asked. The incident reminded both of them that their war against Blackwood wasn't just about personal vengeance. It was about protecting innocent people who had no idea they were targets. Every day they delayed meant more families like the homesteaders would be forced to flee their homes or face murder at the hands of Blackwood's assassins. On the third day, they finally reached the outskirts of Denver, but their relief was short-lived. The city was crawling with territorial marshals and federal agents, all of them carrying wanted posters with detailed descriptions of the fugitives they were hunting. Garrett's contacts in the Federal Marshal Service had clearly reported his suspected treason, making him one of the most wanted men in the territory. We need to get off the main roads, he said as they observed the increased law enforcement presence from a hillside overlooking the city. They've got patrols on every approach route, and they're checking everyone who doesn't look like a local resident. I know another way, Mira said, surprising him once again with her knowledge of terrain and geography. There's an old mining tunnel that connects to the city's storm drainage system. It's dangerous and partially flooded, but it will get us inside the city limits without having to pass any checkpoints. The tunnel proved to be every bit as treacherous as she had warned. They were forced to wade through icy water that reached almost to Mira's chest, following a route that had been abandoned years earlier when the mine played out. The baby kicked constantly in protest at the cold water, and more than once, Mira had to stop and rest as pregnancy-related exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. But the underground route worked exactly as she had hoped. They emerged through a storm drain in one of Denver's poorest neighborhoods, where federal agents were unlikely to patrol, and local residents had learned not to ask questions about suspicious strangers. Within hours, Garrett had made contact with his underground network and begun arranging for the false identities they would need. Papers will be ready tomorrow night, he reported after returning from a clandestine meeting in a warehouse district. Saloon. But there's bad news too. Word is already spreading about what happened at your cabin. Blackwood knows we killed Vance and his men, and he's put a bounty on our heads that's bigger than most people see in a lifetime. How much? Mira asked, though she suspected she didn't really want to know the answer. $10,000. For each of us, dead or alive. That's enough money to turn every bounty hunter, outlaw, and desperate man in the territory into an enemy. We're not just fighting Blackwood's organization anymore. We're fighting anyone who thinks they can get rich by killing us. The news was sobering but not entirely unexpected. Blackwood had built his power through the systematic use of money and violence, so it made sense that he would use both tools to hunt down the people who threatened his empire. The bounty would make their mission infinitely more dangerous, but it wouldn't change their ultimate goal. Then we'd better move fast, Mira said. The longer we wait, the more people will be looking for us, and the more time Blackwood has to prepare his defenses. That night, as they waited for their forged documents in a safe house that smelled of smoke and desperation, Mira felt the baby move in a way that was different from its usual restless kicking. The movement was rhythmic and purposeful, almost as if the child was responding to the rhythm of her heartbeat. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her baby would be born free and safe, where the war they were fighting would be over and justice would finally be served. What are you thinking about? Garrett asked, noticing her contemplative mood. The future, Mira replied. What happens after we finish this? Whether there will be anything left of us when the killing is done. There will be, Garrett said with quiet certainty. We're not doing this for revenge anymore. We're doing it to build something better. Your child deserves to grow up in a world where men like Blackwood can't murder innocent people with impunity. The next morning brought their new identities and the beginning of the most dangerous phase of their mission. According to their forged papers, Mira was now Maria Santos, the Mexican wife of a traveling merchant, while Garrett had become Robert Shaw, a businessman from California looking to invest in territorial mining operations. The disguises were simple but effective, relying more on changed behavior and clothing than on elaborate physical alterations. Remember, Garrett coached her as they prepared to enter Denver's business district. You're a merchant's wife who speaks limited English and defers to her husband in all business matters. Keep your eyes down, speak softly, and let me do most of the talking. And if someone recognizes us despite the disguises? Mira asked. Then we kill them quickly and quietly and hope nobody else notices, Garrett replied matter-of-factly. From this point forward, everyone we meet is either an ally or a potential enemy. There's no middle ground anymore. As they walked through Denver's busy streets, Mira marveled at how completely their new identities seemed to work. Federal agents walked past them without a second glance, and even local law enforcement officers paid no attention to what appeared to be just another traveling couple conducting business in the territorial capital. The power of assumption and expectation was remarkable. People saw what they expected to see and ignored everything else. But their success in avoiding detection brought new challenges. Getting close to Judge Marsh would require more than just false papers and clever disguises. They would need detailed intelligence about his daily routines, the layout of his mansion, and the schedules of his security personnel. Most importantly, they would need a plan for killing him and escaping before his guards could respond. The judge holds court 3 days a week, Garrett reported after spending a day observing the territorial courthouse. But he's most vulnerable on Sunday mornings when he attends services at the Episcopal Church. The building has multiple exits, and his security detail is smaller because they assume nobody would attempt an assassination in a house of worship. Sunday morning it is, Mira agreed, though the irony of planning murder during a church service was not lost on her. How do we get close enough to guarantee a kill shot? We don't, Garrett replied. You stay outside and watch for trouble while I go in and handle Marsh personally. If something goes wrong, you get out of the city and continue the mission without me. Absolutely not, Mira said immediately. We're partners in this, and we stay together. I didn't come this far just to hide outside while you take all the risks. The argument that followed was brief but intense, touching on issues of practicality, survival, and the question of whether a pregnant woman should be directly involved in an assassination attempt. In the end, they reached a compromise that satisfied neither of them completely, but addressed their most pressing concerns about the mission's success. Sunday morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that made shadows deceptive and distances difficult to judge. As church bells rang across Denver, announcing the beginning of services throughout the city, two figures in dark clothing made their way through streets that were unusually quiet for a territorial capital. The hunter had become the hunted, but now it was time to reverse that relationship once more. The Episcopal Church stood like a white monument against the gray Denver sky, its tall spire reaching toward heaven while earthly corruption conducted business in the pews below. Judge Hamilton Marsh arrived precisely at 9:30, just as Garrett had predicted, stepping down from his ornate carriage with the measured dignity of a man who believed himself untouchable. Two bodyguards flanked him as he walked toward the church entrance, but their attention was focused outward toward potential threats from the street, rather than inward toward the congregation they were about to join. Mira watched from her position across the street, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly while her eyes tracked every movement in and around the church. The baby had been unusually active all morning, as if sensing the tension radiating from its mother's body. Through the fabric of her borrowed dress, she could feel the small bulge of the derringer Garrett had insisted she carry, a backup weapon. That would be useless at long range, but deadly effective if anyone got close enough to threaten her directly. Inside the church, Garrett sat 3 rows behind the judge, his head bowed in apparent prayer while his eyes never left his target. The service proceeded with typical Episcopal formality, all ritual and tradition, designed to reinforce social hierarchies and the assumption that God favored those who held earthly power. Judge Marsh participated with obvious comfort, singing hymns and reciting prayers with the same voice he used to pronounce death sentences on innocent Apache men. The plan they had developed was elegant in its simplicity. During the collection of tithes, when congregation members would be moving about and attention would be focused on the passing of offering plates, Garrett would approach the judge under the pretense of making a substantial donation. At close range, with a knife rather than a gun to avoid the noise that would immediately alert security, he would eliminate one of the key figures in Blackwood's conspiracy before anyone realized what had happened. But as the service progressed toward the crucial moment, Mira noticed something that made her blood run cold. Additional men were entering the church, taking positions near the exits and scanning the congregation with the practiced eyes of professional killers. Somehow, despite their careful planning and elaborate disguises, their presence had been detected. Garrett was walking into a trap that would see him captured or killed before he could complete his mission. She had to warn him, but any attempt to signal across the crowded church would expose them both to immediate arrest or execution. The derringer in her dress felt pitifully inadequate against the number of armed men now positioned throughout the building, but it might be enough to create the confusion Garrett would need to fight his way out. As the minister began the familiar ritual of requesting donations for the church's charitable works, Mira made a decision that would determine whether they lived or died. Moving as quickly as her pregnancy would allow, she walked directly through the church's front entrance, her hand already gripping the small pistol concealed beneath her shawl. The bodyguards at the door started to challenge her presence, but she was already past them and moving down the center aisle toward where Judge Marsh sat with his head bowed in hypocritical piety. "Hamilton Marsh," she called out in a voice that carried clearly through the suddenly silent church. "In the name of the Apache people you have murdered, I pronounce sentence upon you." The judge's head snapped up in shock and recognition, his face going pale as he realized that his victims had finally found him. Around the church Blackwoods, hidden gunmen were reaching for their weapons, but Myra's unexpected appearance had caught them off guard and disrupted their carefully planned ambush. In the confusion of that moment, Garrett struck. His knife took the judge in the back, sliding between ribs to pierce the heart with surgical precision. Marsh had time for one shocked gasp before he pitched forward into the pew, his blood spreading across the polished wood like spilled communion wine. The symbolic appropriateness of the scene was not lost on Mira, even as gunfire erupted around them and the church dissolved into chaos. Garrett was already moving, using the panicked congregation as cover while he fought his way toward the side exit where they had planned to make their escape. But Blackwood's men were professionals, and they had positioned themselves to cut off exactly that route. Bullets splintered wooden pews and shattered stained glass windows as the church became a battleground between opposing forces of law and justice. Mira found herself separated from Garrett by the fleeing crowd, pressed against a stone pillar, while gunfire raged around her. The baby was kicking frantically now, responding to her elevated heart rate and the stress of combat. She could see Garrett near the altar, wounded but still fighting, surrounded by enemies who were closing in for the kill. Without hesitation, she raised the derringer and began firing into the group of men threatening him. The small pistol held only 2 shots, but both of them found their marks. One of Blackwood's assassins spun away with a scream, clutching a shattered shoulder, while another dropped his rifle and fell to his knees with Mira's bullet in his chest. The brief respite was enough for Garrett to break free from encirclement and begin fighting his way toward her position. This way, she shouted over the noise of continued gunfire, leading him toward a door she had noticed during their reconnaissance. It opened onto a narrow alley that connected to the storm drainage system they had used to enter the city, providing a potential escape route if they could reach it before being cut down by pursuing enemies. The running battle that followed took them through Denver's backstreets and industrial areas, with Blackwood's men in hot pursuit and local law enforcement joining the chase as word spread of the church shooting. Mira's pregnancy made it impossible for her to maintain the pace that flight required, and more than once Garrett had to carry her bodily over obstacles that would have been simple to navigate under normal circumstances. They finally lost their pursuers in the maze of mining equipment and abandoned buildings that surrounded Denver's played-out gold claims, taking shelter in a mill that had been closed for years. As sirens wailed in the distance and search parties combed the surrounding area, they huddled together in the darkness and tried to catch their breath while planning their next move. "That was a trap from the beginning," Garrett said grimly, checking his wounds by feel in the dim light that filtered through broken windows. "Someone knew we were coming and prepared an ambush. Either our contact betrayed us or Blackwood has better intelligence networks than we thought. Does it matter now?" Mira asked, pressing both hands to her belly as a sharp pain shot through her lower back. "We accomplished what we came to. Marsh is dead, and his death will send a message to everyone else in Blackwood's organization." "Maybe," Garrett agreed. "But killing one corrupt judge won't stop the systematic murder of your people. We've cut off one tentacle of this conspiracy, but the head is still alive and more dangerous than ever. Blackwood will retaliate for what we did today, and innocent people will pay the price." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the mill's broken walls. Multiple riders moving at a gallop, heading directly toward their hiding place with the certainty of men who knew exactly where to find their quarry. Somehow, despite their careful efforts to lose pursuit, they had been tracked to this abandoned building. "How many?" Mira whispered, though she was already checking her remaining ammunition and preparing for what might be their final battle. "At least a dozen," Garrett replied after listening carefully to the hoofbeats. "Too many for us to fight, especially with you in your condition. We need to find another way out of this." But as they searched the mill's interior for alternative escape routes, Mira felt another sharp pain that was unmistakably different from the general discomfort of advanced pregnancy. The stress and physical exertion of the past several hours had triggered something that no amount of determination could overcome. Her baby was coming, and it was coming now, Garrett. she gasped, sinking to her knees as a contraction seized her with overwhelming force. I think we have a bigger problem than Blackwood's men. The timing could not have been worse. Surrounded by enemies, trapped in an abandoned building with no medical supplies or assistance, about to give birth to a child whose father had been murdered by the same men who were now hunting them. But as another contraction gripped her, Mira felt something unexpected, a fierce joy that cut through the pain and fear like sunlight through storm clouds. The baby's coming, she said, and despite everything, she was smiling. Thomas's child is finally coming into the world. Garrett's face went pale with a different kind of fear than he had shown during any of their previous battles. Facing armed killers was one thing. Delivering a baby under combat conditions was entirely another. But he moved immediately to help her, using his coat to create a makeshift bed while keeping his rifle within easy reach. What do I need to do? He asked, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. I've helped with births before, but never under circumstances like these. Just be ready to fight, Mira replied between contractions. This baby is going to be born free, no matter what it costs us. The labor progressed with frightening intensity, compressed by stress and adrenaline into a process that normally took hours, but was happening in a matter of minutes. Outside, Blackwood's men were positioning themselves around the mill, calling for surrender and promising swift death if their demands were met. Inside, new life fought to enter a world that seemed determined to destroy it before it could draw its first breath. When the final contraction came, Mira bit down on a piece of leather to keep from crying out and alerting their enemies to their exact location within the building. The baby emerged in a rush of pain and blood and desperate hope, a perfectly formed little girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined expression. For one terrifying moment, she was silent and still, but then she drew breath and released a cry that seemed to announce her defiance to the entire world. She's beautiful, Garrett whispered, wrapping the infant in his spare shirt while Myra struggled to recover from the ordeal of birth. She looks just like Thomas. The baby's cry had given away their position, and almost immediately they heard boots on the mill's wooden floors as Blackwood's men began searching the building room by room. Garrett raised his rifle, prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible, but Mira had a different idea. Holding her newborn daughter close to her chest, she stood up on unsteady legs and walked toward the sound of approaching footsteps. I want to speak to Colonel Blackwood, she called out in a voice that carried clearly through the abandoned mill. Tell him that Mira Shadowdeer has something he wants to hear. The footsteps stopped, followed by urgent whispered conversation as the searchers debated how to respond to her unexpected surrender. After several minutes, a new voice called back, cultured and authoritative in a way that marked its owner as someone accustomed to command. Mrs. Shadowdeer, the voice said, and she knew immediately that she was hearing Colonel Harrison Blackwood himself. I must say you've caused me considerable inconvenience. The death of Judge Marsh has disrupted several important business arrangements. Good, Mira replied without hesitation. I hope it disrupts many more before we're finished. Blackwood's laughter was cold and humorless. You're hardly in a position to make threats, my dear. You're surrounded, outnumbered, and I'm told you've just given birth. Hardly the circumstances for continued resistance. Maybe not, Myra agreed, but I have something you need. Something that could destroy your entire organization if it falls into the wrong hands. Thomas's evidence, I presume. Yes, Captain Vance mentioned that possibility before his unfortunate demise. I'm prepared to offer you a bargain, your life and freedom, in exchange for all documents and testimony related to my business activities. Mira exchanged glances with Garrett, who nodded slightly to indicate his agreement with the direction of her negotiation. They had anticipated this moment and prepared for it, though neither had expected it to happen while she held a newborn baby in her arms. Not just Thomas's evidence, she said. Everything. Documents we found in Vance's possession, testimony from survivors, financial records proving your theft of federal funds. All of it in exchange for safe passage out of the territory for me, my child, and Marshal Flintridge. An interesting proposal, Blackwood replied after a long pause. But how do I know you haven't made copies? How can I be certain that destroying your evidence will actually end this threat to my operations? Because I give you my word as an Apache woman, Mira said simply. My people may be many things, but we are not liars. If I promise you that all evidence will be destroyed and no copies remain, then that promise will be kept. Another long silence, during which Mira could almost hear the colonel weighing his options and calculating the costs of different courses of action. Finally he spoke again, and she could hear the decision in his voice. Very well. You have 1 hour to produce all evidence and prepare for departure. Any attempt at deception or treachery will result in the immediate death of all three of you. Is that understood? Understood, Mira replied. But the exchange happens in public, in front of witnesses. I don't trust you any more than you trust me. The negotiation that followed was tense and complex, involving not just the exchange of evidence for safe passage but also the practical details of how such a transfer could be accomplished without either party having the opportunity to betray the other. In the end, they agreed to meet at Denver's main train station, where the presence of hundreds of witnesses would theoretically prevent either side from resorting to violence, as they prepared for what might be their final confrontation with Blackwood. Mira looked down at her sleeping daughter and felt a peace she had not experienced since Thomas's death. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she had brought new life into the world and struck a blow against the forces that had tried to destroy her family. The baby stirred in her arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to hold infinite possibilities. What will you name her? Garrett asked as they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the mill. Hope, Mira replied without hesitation. Her name is Hope Shadowdeer, and she's going to grow up in a world where men like Blackwood can't murder innocent people with impunity. The exchange at the train station went exactly as planned, with Blackwood accepting the documents they presented while allowing them to board the eastbound express without interference. But as the train pulled away from Denver, carrying them toward a new life in territories where Blackwood's influence couldn't reach, Mira smiled at a secret she had kept from the colonel. The documents they had given him were real, but they were not complete. Hidden in her baby's blankets were photographs and testimonies that would eventually find their way to newspaper publishers in New York and Boston, ensuring that the truth about territorial corruption would eventually see daylight. Blackwood had won the immediate battle, but the war for justice was far from over. Where will we go? Garrett asked as the Colorado mountains disappeared behind them and the Great Plains opened up ahead. California, Mira replied, holding Hope close as the train rocked gently on its tracks. Thomas always talked about California, about starting fresh where nobody knew our history. It seems like the right place to raise a daughter who's going to change the world. 6 months later, in a small coastal town where the ocean met the sky in an endless line of possibility, Mira Shadowdeer opened her first letter from a New York newspaper publisher. The photographs and documents she had secretly preserved were finally seeing print, and the resulting investigation was bringing down corrupt officials throughout the Western Territories. Colonel Blackwood had been arrested on federal charges, and the systematic murder of Apache leaders had finally been exposed to national scrutiny. Justice, she whispered to baby Hope, who gurgled happily in response. Your father's spirit can finally rest in peace. Garrett appeared in the doorway of their small house, wearing the badge of a California deputy marshal and carrying flowers he had picked from their garden. The wounds of their shared ordeal had healed into something deeper than friendship, but different from romantic love, a partnership forged in blood and sacrifice that would endure for whatever challenges lay ahead. Any regrets? He asked, sitting beside them on the porch where they could watch the sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and crimson. None, Mira replied, and she meant it completely. We did what needed to be done. Hope will grow up free because of the choices we made. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, 3 survivors of a forgotten war sat together in peaceful silence, watching over a future that had been purchased with courage, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief that justice would eventually prevail. The blood in the snow had finally been avenged, and a new generation would inherit a world where truth was stronger than corruption.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.